The rain had been falling over the kingdom of Valoria since dawn, turning the cobblestone streets into shimmering rivers that reflected the golden lights of the ancient palace standing proudly above the city. Merchants hurried to cover their stalls, children ran laughing toward their homes, and noble carriages rushed through the storm without a second glance at the ordinary people struggling beneath the relentless sky. Among those forgotten souls was a young woman named Alara, known throughout her small village not for wealth or beauty, but for the kindness that never left her heart. She lived alone in a tiny wooden cottage at the edge of the forest after losing her parents years before. Every morning she gathered herbs, delivered medicine to the elderly, and quietly helped anyone who crossed her path. She believed that every act of kindness returned one day, though life had rarely rewarded her for such faith. That evening, while carrying a basket covered with cloth to protect the precious herbs inside, she noticed a magnificent black horse racing wildly down the muddy forest road. The frightened animal suddenly reared, throwing its rider into the rushing stream beside the path before disappearing into the darkness. Without stopping to think, Alara dropped her basket and ran toward the water. The current was stronger than it looked, and the unconscious man was already being pulled downstream. Fighting against the freezing water, she grabbed his arm with every ounce of strength she possessed. Her hands slipped several times, but she refused to let go. Inch by inch, she dragged him onto the muddy riverbank, exhausted and soaked to the bone. The stranger wore a dark traveling cloak that concealed expensive clothes beneath it, yet there were no royal guards nearby, no carriage, no symbol revealing his identity. His forehead was bleeding from the fall, and his breathing was shallow. Alara quickly tore a piece of her own dress to bandage the wound before helping him back to her humble cottage. She lit the fireplace, wrapped him in dry blankets, brewed healing herbs, and sat beside him through the entire night while the storm raged outside. Hours later, the stranger slowly opened his eyes. Confused and weak, he looked around the tiny room before his gaze settled on the young woman placing another log into the fire. "Where am I?" he whispered. Alara smiled gently and handed him a cup of warm herbal tea. "You're safe. Your horse threw you into the river. You were lucky the current didn't carry you away." The man studied her face with quiet curiosity. No one had ever looked at him without expectation or fear. "You saved my life," he said softly. Alara shrugged with a warm smile. Anyone would have done the same. He knew that wasn't true. For the first time in years, someone had helped him without asking his name, title, or reward. What Alara did not know was that the man sitting before her was Crown Prince Adrian, the future king of Valoria, who had secretly escaped the palace for a few days seeking freedom from endless royal duties and the arranged marriage that had been forced upon him since childhood. The palace had already chosen his bride, Princess Celeste of a neighboring kingdom, a union designed to secure peace and political power rather than love. Adrian had spent his entire life trapped by expectations, unable to decide even the smallest part of his own future. Yet inside this tiny cottage, surrounded by nothing more than warmth, honesty, and kindness, he felt freer than he ever had within the marble halls of the palace. Neither of them realized that this rainy night had already changed the course of both their destinies. Far away, inside the royal palace, panic spread through the corridors as soldiers searched desperately for the missing prince. Queen Isabella stood beside the grand window watching the storm with growing fear while ministers whispered about the political disaster that would follow if Prince Adrian failed to appear at the royal engagement ceremony only days away. Princess Celeste had already arrived with her family, believing she would soon become queen. The entire kingdom celebrated a wedding that its future groom secretly wished would never happen. Meanwhile, hidden deep within the forest, Adrian laughed for the first time in years as Alara scolded him for trying to stand before his injuries had healed. "You are the most stubborn patient I've ever met," she said with folded arms. Adrian smiled. "Then perhaps I should stay another day so you can continue your excellent care." She rolled her eyes, pretending not to notice how genuine his smile had become. Outside, the rain finally began to fade, but beyond the quiet trees, destiny was already riding toward them. Royal guards had discovered the prince's horse wandering near the forest, and their search was closing in. Neither Adrian nor Alara knew that the peace they shared inside the little cottage would soon be shattered by secrets, duty, and a love that the palace would never allow. The following morning, sunlight filtered through the rain-soaked trees, painting the little cottage in a warm golden glow that seemed almost magical after the violent storm. Prince Adrian awoke to the comforting aroma of fresh bread and herbal tea. For a brief moment, he forgot who he was. There were no servants waiting outside his chamber, no ministers demanding decisions, no royal guards standing watch. There was only peace. He stepped outside and found Alara kneeling beside a small garden, carefully replanting herbs that had been damaged by the storm. Her hands were covered in soil, her simple dress still damp from the previous night, yet she wore a smile that no royal jewel could ever equal. She noticed him watching and laughed softly. "You should be resting, not wandering around with a head injury." Adrian smiled. "I've spent my whole life being told what I should do. It feels nice to ignore those orders for once." Alara shook her head with amusement, unaware that the man speaking those words was the future king himself. She handed him a small wooden basket. "Then, if you insist on ignoring my advice, at least make yourself useful. Help me gather herbs before the sun gets too high." No one had ever spoken to Adrian that way. At the palace, every word directed toward him was carefully measured with respect and fear. Yet Alara treated him as nothing more than another traveler in need of help, and strangely, he preferred it that way. Together they walked through the forest, collecting lavender, mint, wild chamomile, and mountain sage. As they talked, Adrian learned about Alara's life, how she had lost both parents during a harsh winter epidemic, how the villagers had survived only because everyone learned to help one another, and how she believed kindness always returned, even if it took years. Adrian listened quietly, realizing how different her world was from his own. In the palace, every favor came with a price, every smile concealed a motive, and every alliance depended on power rather than compassion. Alara paused beside a stream and looked at him thoughtfully. "You speak like someone carrying a heavy burden." Adrian stared at the flowing water. "What if someone had a duty they never chose?" he asked. "What if everyone expected them to sacrifice their own happiness?" Alara answered without hesitation. "Duty matters, but so does the heart. If a person loses themselves while pleasing everyone else, what kind of life is left?" Her words struck Adrian more deeply than she could possibly know. For years he had accepted that marrying Princess Celeste was simply his fate. He had convinced himself that love was a luxury meant for ordinary people, not for kings. Yet standing beside Alara, hearing such simple wisdom, he felt that belief beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, miles away, the atmosphere inside the royal palace had become increasingly desperate. Commander Roland entered the throne room and bowed before Queen Isabella. "Your Majesty, we found the prince's horse near Blackwood Forest. Search teams are sweeping every nearby village." The queen's face remained calm, but her fingers tightened around the armrest of the throne. "Find him before sunset," she ordered. "If the neighboring kingdom discovers the prince has disappeared days before the engagement ceremony, decades of peace negotiations could collapse." Standing nearby, Princess Celeste silently observed every word. She was elegant, intelligent, and admired throughout the kingdom, yet she could sense something was terribly wrong. She had spent years preparing to become Adrian's wife, but deep inside, she had always suspected that duty, not love, was the only reason this marriage existed. Back in the forest, Adrian and Alara returned to the cottage laughing after Adrian accidentally slipped into a muddy puddle while trying to imitate her knowledge of wild plants. Alara laughed so hard that tears filled her eyes. Adrian laughed with her, realizing it had been years since anyone had made him forget the weight of the crown waiting for him. As evening approached, they shared a humble dinner of vegetable soup and homemade bread beside the fireplace. Adrian looked around the tiny room once more. There was no luxury, no gold, no marble walls. Yet it felt more like home than the palace ever had. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Alara asked. "For reminding me that life can still be simple." Before she could answer, distant sounds echoed through the forest. Horses, Many of them. Adrian immediately recognized the disciplined rhythm of royal cavalry. His expression changed instantly. Alara noticed. "What's wrong?" He stood and looked through the window. Torches flickered between the trees, growing closer every second. The search party had arrived. The peaceful world they had shared for 2 precious days was about to end. Adrian closed his eyes, knowing that once the palace found him, nothing would ever be the same again. Alara watched him with growing confusion. "Who are you?" she whispered. Adrian slowly turned toward her, pain visible in his eyes. Before he could answer, the cottage door burst open. Dozens of royal guards rushed inside, swords drawn before immediately dropping to one knee. Their commander lowered his head and spoke the words that shattered Alara's world forever. "Your Royal Highness, thank heaven we found you." Alara froze. The cup slipped from her trembling hands and shattered across the wooden floor. She stared at the man she had rescued from the storm, the man who had laughed beside her, worked in her garden, and shared simple meals in her tiny cottage. He wasn't an ordinary traveler. He was the crown prince of Valoria, and the entire palace had already chosen his future bride. The silence inside the cottage felt heavier than the storm that had brought them together. Alara stood motionless, unable to take her eyes off Adrian as the shattered pieces of the clay cup lay scattered across the wooden floor. Every memory of the past 2 days rushed through her mind. The stranger she had pulled from the river, the laughter they had shared while gathering herbs, the quiet conversations beside the fire, and the gentle smile that had made her believe she had finally met someone who understood her heart. Now every moment seemed wrapped in a truth too impossible to accept. He was not a traveler. He was the future king of Valoria. Adrian took a hesitant step toward her, but she instinctively stepped back. It wasn't fear she felt, it was heartbreak. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian lowered his head. "I never wanted to deceive you." "But you did," she replied, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Every question I asked, every story you told, you hid the one truth that mattered." Before Adrian could answer, Commander Roland interrupted respectfully. "Your Royal Highness, we must return to the palace immediately. The Queen has ordered every guard in the kingdom to search for you. The engagement ceremony begins tomorrow evening." Those words struck Alara like lightning. "Engagement?" she repeated quietly. Roland looked at her with sympathy before answering. "His Royal Highness is to be formally engaged to Princess Celeste, future Queen of Valoria." Adrian closed his eyes. He had hoped to spare Alara from learning the truth this way. Instead, the truth had arrived with armored soldiers and royal commands. Alara forced herself to smile, though her heart was breaking with every breath. "Then congratulations, Your Highness," she said softly. "It seems your family has been waiting for you." Adrian stepped closer. "Alara, listen to me." She gently shook her head. "No. I understand now. You belong to a world where people like me are only passing moments. I was simply the girl who happened to find you in the rain." Adrian's voice became firm. "You are much more than that." But before he could explain, Roland spoke again. "Forgive me, Your Highness, but every minute we delay increases the political danger. The palace cannot wait any longer." Adrian looked between the commander and Alara, feeling as though his heart were being torn in two. Finally, with visible pain, he removed a silver pendant bearing the royal crest from beneath his shirt. It was a family heirloom passed down through generations of kings. He placed it gently into Alara's hand. "Keep this," he whispered, "until I return." Alara stared at the pendant in disbelief. "Return?" Adrian nodded. "I made you a promise without realizing it. I promised myself that I would never forget the woman who saved my life, not only from the river, but from becoming someone I no longer recognized." Before she could answer, the guards escorted Adrian toward his waiting horse. He turned back one final time. Their eyes met across the rain-soaked path. Neither of them spoke. Words were too small for the pain they carried. Then the prince disappeared into the forest, surrounded by soldiers, leaving Alara standing alone before her little cottage. She watched until the last torch vanished into the darkness. Only then did she allow the tears to fall. Days later, The entire kingdom celebrated the royal engagement. Streets were decorated with banners, bells rang from every tower, and thousands gathered outside the palace to witness history. Inside the magnificent ballroom, nobles from distant kingdoms applauded as Prince Adrian stood beside Princess Celeste. Dressed in royal white and gold, he looked every bit the future king everyone expected him to become. Yet behind his calm expression, his thoughts never left the small cottage hidden deep within the forest. Queen Isabella noticed the sadness in her son's eyes. "Smile," she whispered. "The kingdom is watching." Adrian forced a smile, but it never reached his eyes. Across the hall, Princess Celeste quietly observed him. She was intelligent enough to recognize that the man standing beside her was physically present, but emotionally somewhere else. When the ceremony ended, she approached Adrian privately. "There is someone else, isn't there?" she asked gently. Adrian remained silent. His silence answered the question. Celeste sighed sadly. "I always feared this day would come. We were raised to believe duty could replace love." Adrian looked at her with surprise. "I'm sorry." Celeste smiled sadly. "So am I." Far away in the forest, Elara returned to her ordinary life. She continued helping villagers, gathering herbs, and caring for those in need, but the laughter that once filled her cottage had disappeared. Every evening, she looked toward the distant palace lights shimmering on the horizon, wondering whether the prince had already forgotten the girl who had rescued him during the storm. She held the silver pendant tightly in her hands, the only proof that those unforgettable days had truly happened. Little did she know that destiny had not finished writing their story. The palace had chosen a bride, but fate had chosen a queen. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart and you want to discover what happens next, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next emotional chapter of this unforgettable royal love story.